Kia ora, nau mai ki te whare. Welcome to the House, ko Lui Kolonzaho. The Parliament Bill arrived back in the House this week after 6 months in Select Committee. In a nutshell, it consolidates existing legislation relating to the operation of Parliament and makes some changes to the powers of Parliament security officers, as well as the funding arrangements of Parliament agencies, the Office of the Clerk and Parliamentary Service. Despite being critically important to a functioning democracy, it would be fair to say that constitutional law reform isn't exactly everyone's cup of tea. But because the topic attracts the likes of former politicians, constitutional lawyers, academics, and other pontificators, there were some quite profound suggestions during the submissions process. I sat down with two members of the Parliament Bill Committee for a chat about the bill and its submissions, which turned into a wider chinwag on the constitutional implications of the bill.
Hi, Andy Foster here. I'm a New Zealand First List MP based in Wellington.
Kia ora, I'm Ricardo Menendez March. I'm a Green Party List MP and I'm the Green Party Musterer.
Well, it's codifying a whole lot of the way in which Parliament works, and it replaces 4 existing bills, and it also brings in a range of different new powers and rules and regulations, etc., which we're going to talk through today.
More importantly, I think it also modernises certain aspects of Parliament, including, for example, decisions in relationship to how our parliamentary bodies are funded will now be passed on to parliamentarians rather than just being held by the executive.
So for people that don't know, how is the funding currently arranged? What's the status quo?
The Minister of Finance puts out a budget. It obviously goes through the executive process. That's where that power is held. But of course, Parliament actually is the sovereign body, not the executive. So I guess the constitutional principle here is that Parliament should be able to set its own arrangements.
For many governments, it'll be in their interest to under-resource Parliament because it reduces the ability for non-executive members to actually hold government to account. And what we have had is a growing number of people, a stagnant number of MPs, and a chronically underfunded Parliament, which then results in our ability to A, serve our constituents, but also hold government to account when issues are getting more complex.
I should just clarify for the public that parliamentary agencies are Office of the Clerk and Parliamentary Service, and they both support your work in select committees and with your officers and community.
I don't think this is not about that particular bit. It's not about parliamentarians funding themselves. It is about the two organisations which work together to make the process of Parliament work. And the buildings of Parliament and the grounds of Parliament work, and all of the things around, for example, the engagement of the public with the Parliament. So it's not about parliamentarians looking after themselves, it's about looking after the way in which Parliament functions on behalf of and for and with the people of New Zealand.
For everyday people, the impact is that when we have a chronically underfunded Parliament, it impedes everyday people from participating in our democratic process in a much more fulsome way. That could include, for example, how accessible submission-making process could be made in terms of, for example, having interpreters, having access to translation services, and also recognizing that as we have a much more diverse population, also actually constituency-based MPs are currently not resourced to actually meet the needs of our constituents. So by having a much better resource Parliament and those decisions being held actually by Parliament rather than the executive, we're able to actually much more accurately reflect funding decisions in relationship to the needs of our communities.
While I might agree with the general point that Ricardo's made, I think using words like chronically underfunded and suggesting significant changes required, I think it is at the margins, but it is nevertheless important, and I think it's the constitutional principle too, that Parliament is able to make its decisions about those things because they are about the operation of Parliament on behalf of the people of New Zealand and allowing, as Ricardo said, people to be able to engage with the parliamentary process, that is Parliament's responsibility, not the executive's.
So in that recommendation that you put in the bill, it says that the funding model will essentially mirror Ombudsman, the Office of the Parliament, that are currently before the Office of the Parliament Committee, which is a government committee if you count the Speaker being on the government side. Given it's not a split or opposition-led committee, how do you ensure that the Select Committee doesn't get in the way of the independence from the executive?
That is an ongoing problem we have in the makeup of Select Committees, and I think Parliament has continued to struggle to grapple with the reality that right now, because Select Committees are predominantly held by members of the executive, of parties that are part of the executive, what that means is that decisions by non-executive members tend to reflect the wishes of the executive. That is something that I still think needs to be resolved. And that also requires potentially not just a conversation about the makeup of select committees, but actually for non-executive members to take that role really seriously, that even if your party belongs in government, if you're not a member that is not part of the executive, you still have a role to hold executive to account. And so I think it will require both a culture shift within Parliament as well as a longer conversation about the makeup of select committees in general.
Look, I think the point is well made in my relatively limited experience, because this is only my first term, but the select committees I've been part of, you have genuinely seen members of both sides of the House, asking really good searching questions, trying to get good outcomes and provide good reports. But I do also see the times that there is pressure from the executive to get a particular outcome. So I do think this is a substantive constitutional conversation about how does the Parliament interface with the executive, and I think that is a real issue. It's an interesting one to think about, and obviously there is some degree of wariness right across the House, I think.
For anyone watching our select committee procedures and even question time in the House, having sat at basically almost every select committee in Parliament over 4 years, the reality is that there is the issue of patsy questions, for example, being asked in times of scrutiny. So when it comes to, for example, the Parliament bill, and then how select committees make decision on how we resource Parliament, that is what I mean about the need to have a culture shift for members who are not part of the executive to really be invested in having a well-resourced Parliament, because it actually benefits our communities. It benefits our communities being able to interface with democracy altogether. And a really good example in regards to what I meant about chronically underfunded is that recently, because we have seen bills that have attracted a really large public interest, we have seen firsthand how the clerk, for example, has genuinely struggled to have the resources to process things in a timely manner. Those are the real life implications for our communities when it comes to engaging in democratic processes that in an institution that has genuinely just simply not kept up with inflation when it comes to the cost pressures that they're facing. And so that's exactly what I mean by chronically underfunded, simply not even keeping up with inflation.
Was it valuable to you both to be able to have a forum to discuss these constitutional things that perhaps are kind of kept to the brims of academia?
What was really useful as well was to have a conversation about how Parliament can enable people from much more diverse backgrounds to be able to actually see themselves becoming MPs. An example of that is the broadening of family to include adult dependents when it comes to the support that MPs can receive once they're in Parliament. Because right now, for example, if you have an adult dependent who's, for example, disabled and needs additional care, that could be a barrier for somebody to see themselves as an MP if they have those family responsibilities. So I think one of the things that this bill is hopefully going to do as well is broaden the scope of who can see themselves running for Parliament and actually being able to be a competent MP because they're being supported to do so.
Now let's move on to the potential for a parliamentary budget office. They have them in Australia. I think there's one in the UK. Quite a lot of parliaments have them. How would that work?
This is something the Green Party has been calling for quite some time, about having the resources for opposition to independently cost policies and proposals. Because parties who don't have access to the Treasury benches have very little resources to actually cost their own policies. And I think it's important that we're able to actually quantify, for example, if we want to propose amazing radical things, like, for example, having more of our healthcare system being in the public hands, that we're able to actually communicate to the public how much that will cost and to have the resources to do so. That actually evens the playing field when it comes to the contest of ideas and for opposition to have the resources to then cost those policies. I think that will improve the transparency and the information that the public has in relationship to proposals that are put out by opposition. And in some ways, it also holds opposition more to account by the fact that it means we can't just put out policies without then having done a bit more of the homework on the fiscal implications of what we're proposing.
So you can't just say everyone gets a free car and people go, oh, that sounds like a great policy.
I doubt the Greens would ever say everybody get a free car. Maybe it might be a free bike or something like that. But look, I think, in all seriousness, that I think the proposition's a really good one, because we do hear a lot of both, frankly, from both sides of the House, and as you get close to elections, it tends to get worse. You hear basically promises being made about various different proposals, and have a realistic costing around those sort of things, I think will be immensely valuable. The more that the public can have confidence that what is being proposed will cost X or Y, the better it is. And I think it is a good discipline, and hopefully would result in better decisions, but also the right kind of things being put in front of the public.
The success of those things, including, for example, how much research an opposition MP has access to via the parliamentary library, will ultimately depend on the members of that committee to take a non-partisan approach to the funding of Parliament, so that actually we take a long-term view of saying no matter who's in the executive, no matter who's in opposition, for the sake of democracy, we should have a well-resourced institution that allows non-executive members to put out ideas and hold the executive to account.
I should just add that we're having this conversation because a lot of the submissions you received mentioned the possibility of a parliamentary budget office. What did the public say about it?
I think broadly there was some support for the idea. People thought it was a very good concept.
Anything else that was interesting from the submissions that you thought, I didn't think that would come up?
Something that was raised was the reality that the number of MPs that we have hasn't kept up with population changes. And that actually, I think, is a really good question that I want the public to consider going forward. Because as our population grows and the number of MPs remain the same, each MP actually has to serve a greater number of people.
In terms of the first one of those things, the number of MPs, I mean, I would obviously note that our parliament is relatively large compared to our population, compared to many other countries. That doesn't mean that we've got the right number or that they've got the wrong number. But the interesting question, which I don't think any of the submitters answered when they raised that proposition, was, is Parliament operating in the most effective and efficient way? It doesn't mean that you stop doing things, you don't stop scrutinising.
How do you measure efficiency?
As a relatively newbie to the Parliament, but you look at some of the way in which the debate goes, and it's two sides talking at each other, not necessarily making progress because of what is said in the chamber. I think in the select committee environment, you get a lot more collegiality and to and fro, but when it comes to the debate in the chamber, not as much. And I think there could be some merit in thinking about how we do those processes. I mean, you look at the Committee of the Whole House, which is an examination of the detail of a bill. And you see how many times anything actually changes as a result of all that. And I think you wonder about the effectiveness of that time spent.
I think that has more to do with the hyper-partisan nature of the approach to Parliament. And I guess in terms of but I think to me that's a culture thing, not about whether our processes should actually enable the idea that you could, in theory, work in good faith, that if somebody proposes a good idea, that it should be taken as such. I think to me the other thing in relationship to the number of MPs, which I know that it's been something that's been raised as part of the process and has been an ongoing conversation for years, that I would challenge the idea that we have a lot of MPs per population. I think the number has been stagnant, the population has rapidly grown, and I think there are other comparative examples where the number of legislators per head of population is much more balanced. At the end of the day, I go back to the reality that, for example, as somebody who's an immigration spokesperson for the party, I can see how the number of constituency requests has increased even in the 4 years that I have been in Parliament, and that we're not resourced to do that. Again, I go back to, I hope that all these conversations are centered on the issues of how can we best serve our communities and how can we actually have a functioning democratic system, despite, I guess, the very complicated history of how Parliament was set up.
How do we ensure that people are interested? This is important stuff. This is important lawmaking for our constitutional arrangements. How do we get the public more engaged in civics?
Most fundamental thing is that we should be teaching the way in which our system works, the history of our system and how it's got to be where it's got to, because it's not always been the same. We used to have two houses, for example, and some part of the school curriculum I think will be valuable, so that people at least have a fundamental understanding of the way the system works.
I would challenge the idea that there is a lack of civic participation, and that if anything, over the past year and a bit, we have seen an upsurge of people engaging with our parliamentary processes. If anything, what that exposes is that we don't have the resources available to facilitate that engagement. So what I hope is that the Parliament Bill will result in the ability to better resource the mechanisms that allow everyday people to engage with parliamentary processes. And that therefore, whenever there are bills, whether it's the Treaty Principles Bill or whether there's, the repeal of 7AA or the Social Security Amendment Bill that received a large number of submissions, that we actually have the resources to ensure that everyone can be heard, that everyone who participated in that process can feel like they're part of lawmaking. And so, if anything, I think this bill can be the solution to facilitating greater civic participation.
That was the Greens' Ricardo Menendez March and New Zealand First's Andy Foster. I te whakaronga koe ki te whare. You've been listening to The House, a program made with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mā te wā.